Hello, I'm Franey, the Director of International Programming, and we are honored to have with us the director of the film, Phil Grabsky. Phil, welcome virtually back to Vancouver.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
You've been a guest of the festival a number of times with your films on artists and on composers, but I believe your first trip to Vancouver was with the film, the boy who plays on the steps of Bamiyan. So that was 2004, correct?
It was, yes.
How many times have you actually been to Afghanistan since the making of that film?
I first started going in 2002, and I'm pretty sure I was the first filmmaker into Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. I think in total I've been 6 or 7 times, but I was very, very fortunate, almost by chance. Well, it was by chance, really. I met and hooked up with an Afghan filmmaker who became the co-director, an extraordinary man called Shoaib Sharifi, who is currently in Kabul. And lives in Kabul and has no plans to leave at the moment. After that first film, The Boy Who Plays in the Buddhas of Bamiyan, I did then make a second film about Mir and followed his life for 10 years. That was called The Boy Mir, 10 Years in Afghanistan. And I was, for various reasons, I was going to wrap it at that point. I was going to stop. 3 things changed that briefly. One was having met Shoaib, and Shoaib being in Afghanistan opened up the possibility of keeping up regular filming with Mir. Secondly, I realized, which I'd known anyway, but it became even more apparent that even 10 years wasn't enough to really get a sense of whether the international intervention was going to succeed, or if it was going to succeed, to what extent it was going to succeed, or if it was going to fail, how badly. And the third thing, which you'll know all too well, Alan, and your audience will know, but you know, every filmmaker has doors that open and close depending on funding. And it is extraordinarily difficult to fund these types of films. And I was very frustrated by that. But there was one broadcaster who came to me, a German broadcaster came to me and said, "We'd like you to carry on." And that triggered the thought, yeah, okay, with Shoaib, I will.
When was the last time you were in Afghanistan? How long ago was that?
I personally have not been since 2011. It's all been Shoaib. My job has been to keep the ball rolling, to guide Shoaib in what footage we needed, to edit that footage back here in Brighton with a fantastic editor. And again, there were 2 or 3 reasons. I'm frustrated by not having been. And in fact, I have a visa in my passport now. I was planning to go next month. That looks very unlikely now. I don't want to give too much. Well, Mir moved to Kabul. And it became clear that for him to be seen being filmed by a Western filmmaker wasn't very sensible. And, you know, Shoaib was getting plenty of footage of Mir indoors, but outdoor scenes just would have been very difficult for me. Now, there had been some kind of hairy moments on the trips that I'd had, but it became worse. And there were a number of people saying, "We really don't want you to go," both on a personal level and also the German broadcaster said, we have to say that with Shoaib there filming, we don't want you to go as well. And then there was also a kind of creative decision that I took, which was that I quite liked the transition in the film from initially when I went, I'm a Western filmmaker going on my own and being very curious, but still looking in from the outside. As that second film progressed, so we got into we're making the film 10 years in Afghanistan, and I'm working with Shoaib. It becomes more of an alliance, a filming alliance between a Western filmmaker and an Afghan filmmaker. I also kind of deliberately wanted Shoaib, with a lot of guidance from me, I have to say, but also to take the lead as an Afghan filmmaker and really to dig even deeper into that family dynamic, particularly because Mir gets married. And the kind of access we got into the family with Mir's mother and Mir's wife would have been very difficult for me. I had some of that, I achieved some of that, but what Shoaib has achieved, I mean, I've not seen a film like it in terms of really getting a sense of what it's like for an Afghan family. So for all these reasons, Shoaib and I decided that the onus on filming would lay with him.
That makes sense. Now, you must be in a flurry of activity now with events and the world's eyes on Afghanistan. Can you just describe a bit what that's been like?
It's been quite interesting because for years, I've been trying to get broadcasters interested. And it's really frustrated me. You know, I had the two previous films about Mir, Boy Who Plays the Buddha's Bamiyan, Boy Mir, 10 Years in Afghanistan. In the film festival world, did very well. I think we won something like 21 awards. I don't know. Anyway, we won lots of awards. And when broadcasters showed it, they got a very strong reaction from their audience. But when I went back and said, okay, now we're doing a film which will be 20 years and we'll have much more, and unlike the first two films, I deliberately tried to show what was happening in Afghanistan, but purely through how it was affecting Mir. So there was a little bit of news footage and a little bit of audio, radio footage, but it was all trying to show through the prism of his life. So we took the decision with the third film that we'd be a bit more, there'd be more context. So there'd be more news footage. So that if you just wanted to watch one film that gave you a sense of what had happened in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, this was the one film. And most films about Afghanistan, I have to say, I've always taken, you know, I've been with the military, the Canadian military, the French military, the Australian military. Perfectly valid, but as a block of work was skewed so much to what it was like for our military. And I saw very few films about what it's actually like for the Afghans. And if you want to understand Afghanistan, if you want to understand what's happening there now, or who are those new neighbors that have just come to your town or village, then this is the film to watch. Of course, I'm constantly chasing broadcasters and saying, and funders, and there was that sense of, well, Afghanistan, and quite rightly, Syria became a big subject, and I quite understand that, and ISIS was a big subject. And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing what's happening in Afghanistan now is that people kind of got tired of it. We spent $2.7 trillion. There were Canadian soldiers, men and women, working extraordinarily hard, putting their lives at risk, but everyone was kind of ignoring it. And that was reflected on television. Jump forwards to last year. President Trump makes a deal with the Taliban. It is a terrible deal. And anyone that says this wasn't predictable is just a fool. Because what he said was, look, stop shooting American troops and we'll go. Taliban said, thank you very much. So they're in Doha. They don't even have the democratically elected, quote unquote, I mean, there are issues about that, but democratically elected government of Afghanistan that the Americans and everyone else, of 40 countries in this coalition, had put into power. They don't even have them at the negotiating table. They're basically told what the deal is. And the deal is the Americans will leave next year, just stop shooting us. There hadn't been any Americans killed for 2 years until that terrible suicide bomb last week at the airport. So the Taliban at that point know that they've won. I'm not a politician, but I know that they've won. Then President Biden comes in and he says, here's the date. We're going to leave by September the 11th. Such a powerful, and that was a terrible event. It's a very significant date. He's playing to a domestic audience as Trump was. Again, the Taliban go, great. You then have the Americans, leaving bases. The Afghan troops would wake up in the morning, the Americans had gone. They hadn't even said goodbye. It's just such a mess. And so now that the Taliban are back in power, now some of these broadcasters that have didn't even respond to my emails, now they want the film. Well, I'm very pleased they want the film. I just think they could have shown the film on the 20th anniversary of the initial intervention. They didn't really need for something to go wrong, as in some ways it has. But the film is now attracting a lot of attention and will be seen worldwide on television stations. That's why but for me, you see, that's why I feel so respectful and in admiration of and friendly towards you guys, because it's like, I never take VIFF for granted, but you'd said yes to the film before this happened. And, I have a lot of respect for that, whereas other people are now saying yes, but because Afghanistan's in the news. We have to educate people, whether it's ordinary people, just, or our own politicians, because the more we understand who the Afghans are, perhaps the less these kind of things will happen.
Can I ask you, in your conversations with Shoaib over time, if there's a common theme, or say a more recent iteration of this, about what you feel is the greatest misunderstanding of Afghanistan for Westerners because of media coverage?
The first prompt for me before I met Shoaib to go to Afghanistan was because I knew as a filmmaker that it could not be true that all Afghan men were kind of black-bearded, malevolent terrorists, and all women were mutes behind their burqas. I'd traveled enough in the world to know that simply can't be the case, even though cumulatively that's kind of the image that we had of Afghanistan. It seemed like a very scary place. We didn't hear female voices, and the male voices, they just seemed to be fighting each other. Now, there's an element of truth there. But I remember second day in Kabul, my very first trip, I'm driving along and there's a kid in front of me on a skateboard. When I got to Bamiyan, I went down to the destroyed Buddhas, my first tape, and in fact, there's some shots in the film. And, I would have been arrested, perhaps beaten up if I'd been filming a few months earlier. There are 3 men at 6 a.m. clearing up the rubble, big shovels, big men. And I thought, well, what's going to happen when I start filming them? And I was on my own. My fixer translator was asleep back where I was staying. And you know what they did? 2 of them started singing, and one of them jumped into the wheelbarrow and started dancing. The point is that I find, when I travel the world, 95% of people that you meet are so nice, so hospitable. And it's very easy for that not to make the news. What makes the news are the awful events. If you only read about the awful events in the United States, you would never travel there, because you'd think that you're just going to be shot or stabbed. But of course, we don't think when we get onto a plane to New York, we think it's going to be perfectly safe. In my opinion, the most danger that I was in Afghanistan actually was on the roads, because the driving was really bad. That said, when it goes wrong in Afghanistan, it goes badly wrong. And I was scared at times because journalists were pulled out of cars and executed summarily. It was dangerous. But you could work around it, and you could keep yourself safe, really, pretty much, unless you were very unlucky. So the thing about Afghanistan is just to explain who the Afghan people are. And that's probably true of many countries. And the thing to understand, and the thing that should, of course, come through in the film very clearly, is that to understand Afghanistan, you have to understand they are desperately poor. Now, if there'd been this international intervention, imagine some kind of sci-fi film where US and NATO arrive in 12th or 13th century Britain, which is medieval, when 95% of the population are engaged in the production of food, which is all about growing grain, going down to the watermill to create flour, etc., etc. And then that US NATO force in the 13th century in medieval England are told you've got 10 years to bring it up to the 21st century. Well, you think that was absurd. Well, that's kind of what was happening in Afghanistan. It was medieval. And I knew that people had to take, there was a real opportunity here. People welcomed these troops, welcomed the NGOs, welcomed the charity, welcomed Western intervention, Japanese and other. But it's not something you can do in 2 years or 10 years or even 20 years. It had to be something where they said it's going to take us 50 years, it's going to take 100 years. And it had to be, this is a key mistake, is there was no military success to be had. The only success militarily was to create the space in which there could be a political, social, economic success. So again, one of the things that Shoaib made very clear to me when I would talk to him, he'd say, look, no, you cannot beat the Taliban. As they've said, you've all have heard their phrase, you have the clocks, we have the time. And it's remarkable now to see how they've conquered Afghanistan in a way that the Americans, 800,000 American soldiers went through Afghanistan and they couldn't beat the Taliban. Taliban have now taken over the entire country. They know how to win wars in a way that we just simply don't. When you talk to Afghans, and this is something that Shoaib made clear to me, their concern wasn't the Taliban, really. Their concern was that the warlords had not been dealt with, that there was terrible corruption in the government, crime was as bad as it'd ever been, and there was 40 to 50% unemployment. These were the concerns. But Alan, it has to be said, and this is important, anyone that says it's been a complete waste of time is also wrong. And it's an easy thing to say. It's been a terrible waste of time. $2.7 trillion American dollars, 3,500 military lost their lives. It was a sacrifice. It wasn't worth making. Okay, it's not for me. Each of you in the audience have to decide, was it worth it? I have my view, you'll have your view. But did things change? Yes. Afghan society today is different to how it was 20 years ago. There is a civil society now that didn't exist 20 years ago. The kind of work that's been done by extraordinary charities, NGOs, and yes, government officials, and yes, people within the military, has changed things. And that actually is why the Taliban now are certainly talking a different game. But just today, when we're recording this, they've announced their government, which is all men. And they've got a couple of pretty unpleasant guys within that government. And they've got that ministry back of what's it called? The Ministry of, anyway, the one that looks, well, they're painting over graffiti in Kabul and putting up slogans. And, if in the next few days they decide that women have to wear burqas rather than just the headscarf, that's a really bad sign. I mean, we don't know how it's going to go. But it is plausible that the Taliban realize that this is a different civil society and it cannot be controlled by violence alone, because it's a very young country, 40 million people, the majority are under 25, which is in itself symptomatic of the wars that they've been through. And if you imagine, if you're 20 or under, you haven't lived under the Taliban really before, but you've been plugged into the internet. You've been watching the same YouTubes as our kids have been watching, listening to the same music, watching the same films. When I went 20 years ago, I can't remember a mobile phone. don't think there was one. I could only communicate out of the country with a satellite phone. Now everybody has a mobile phone. That's transformational. That changes the country. There have been 2 million girls that have gone to school. Now, maybe that's going to end. The Taliban are saying that they want girls to still go to school till they're in their late teens. We'll see. When I first went, it was the worst, I think one of the worst 3 countries in the world to have a child, have a baby. The infant mortality rate was dreadful. I think that's improved. So you know, there's been improvements. The trouble is that much more should have been done to stop the corruption. Much more should have been done to stop the crime. Much more should have been done to say, well, we're not going to talk to the Taliban, but we're also not going to talk to these warlords because they're guilty of war crimes too. And I guess the last thing I'll say, and I know it's a bit of a long-winded kind of, is maybe the whole thing would have been better under the banner of the United Nations, and not American soldiers and British soldiers and French soldiers and Canadian soldiers. Because I think, you know, if you lived in Vancouver and you were taken over by, I guess it'd be easy to say the United States, but if you were taken over by anyone, the French, you would be frustrated if the French were driving down your highways and knocking other cars out of the way and then putting concrete blocks throughout Vancouver and taking over buildings. And I mean, even if you kind of rationally thought they're trying to help, you'd be so frustrated with the way that they were behaving that you would turn against them. And then when they unleashed a couple of drones, and these drones might take out somebody that you and I might not like, but they also kill the driver and they kill passengers and they kill passers-by, and they might actually make a mistake and kill, you know, people in hospitals. People didn't make any distinction between the suicide bombs of the Taliban and, you know, drone strikes that hit schools or whatever. So, you know, plenty of mistakes have been made. And all of that, or much of that, is reflected in this funny, dramatic, gripping, sad, humorous story of Mir's life.
There's so much we could talk about here, and I know you're not a politician, but I wonder what you think might happen now with the influence of China and soft power into what could be a bit of a vacuum.
Well, one of the hardest things with this film was, I mean, it's been quite hard at times because the news has often been bad out of Afghanistan and miserable. But I've been collecting newspaper cuttings and recording radio and videoing film clips and for years. So when you come then to edit a film and try to pick just the right little moments to tell the story, you know, imagine, I mean, as you know, I do a lot of art films and they're usually biographical. So trying to put Caravaggio's life in 90 minutes is a challenge. If I was trying to put your life in 90 minutes, what little moments. But it was very important in this film that it wasn't just suicide bombings and you know, American and Afghan troops fighting the Taliban, but also it was Chinese investment, Russian investment, Qatari investment, Indian investment. There has been a lot of investment coming in. Again, when these countries started to feel there was some security, they started to put money in. And some of it's altruistic, but actually that's not really how governments work. Much of it was either for the potential of commercial profit or, as you say, soft power. And so China, they've been hovering, but they've been scared off by the insecurity, but they're obviously back now. Russia. Now, there is a question of morality here. And I think there are obviously examples of these countries who will talk to governments irrespective of their morality and how they treat women or various, you know, groups that you and I would want to be fully supported. But in a way, what you don't want is The one thing to understand about the Taliban is, unlike ISIS, the Taliban, I think, have never really had much interest in exporting their form of, their idea of an Islamic state, a caliphate, to the outside world. That's never been their interest. They're just interested in Afghanistan. Whereas ISIS wants to basically conquer the world with the way that it thinks. But I don't think the Taliban this time around want to be a pariah state. And not least because there's a fortune, there is billions of dollars which is currently frozen. They know that they can't, they don't have enough men to run the government. They didn't control all of Afghanistan last time, they do this time, so they know they need help. It also has to be understood that they're suffering from climate change like everybody else. Right now, half the country is suffering from hunger, partly because there's been a drought. So they're already talking to the Chinese, and the Chinese are talking to them, and the Russians, and the Indians, and the Pakistanis. I don't know about Iran, but that won't be too far off. And in a way, it's probably not a bad thing, because, you know, it will encourage, in a sense, you know, if you can, I think the future in a way is to try, I mean, they're in control and they're not going to be kicked out. So our hope is that you can somehow normalize them and somehow say, actually, you can still, it can be an Islamic state, but actually it's to your advantage that women go to university. It's to your advantage that you imprison thieves. So it's just my opinion, but you imprison thieves rather than cutting their hands off. I mean, it's just, but you have to kind of work with them. And actually, the only problem with that, of course, is that one can make the argument that evidence of Russians or Chinese or Pakistanis or whoever having this kind of morality going alongside their desire for soft political power or economic gain, you know, has maybe been a bit absent, or has been absent too frequently. I think that's why we make films. It's to inform people, but also to just kind of nudge people towards, you know, a morality, a shared humanity. Our world is so extraordinary. I mean, there's no evidence to me that there's another planet that has this kind of beauty, and yet it was a small percentage of our population just wants to screw it up so badly. It makes me so mad. Afghanistan is a beautiful country and they're fantastic people, and they've just had 40 years of horror. And yet, coming back to Mir, he astounds me, because actually 2 nights ago we did something for the first time, which he did a live television interview, and he's still smiling. It doesn't. Whatever he goes through, he just comes out smiling. I don't want people to think that means we shouldn't feel sympathetic towards him or understand he's had a really tough time. But also we can admire his resolution and his resolve. But yes, how the story of Afghanistan now plays out is very hard to predict.
I think that's a good place to end it. And I want to thank you so much for the film and this whole project that you've made your life of including Afghanistan in our inquiry and needing to know. It's so valuable, Phil, and we really appreciate it. And thank you for taking the time to be with us here at this moment.
I'll just say one last thing, which is that, you know, there are plenty of filmmakers who share the desire to kind of show what's going on, go and look for themselves. And, you know, we're supported by film festivals like yourselves. But there are plenty of platforms for our films, but it still remains the case that broadcasters have an enormously important role to play. And if the broadcasters start thinking either our audience is not interested, which is a terrible way of thinking, or it's not going to get a big enough audience, therefore we won't show it, we'd rather show, you know, celebrities in bikinis on desert islands, it's a disaster. But it's more than, it's a disaster because then people aren't informed. And I mean, what I've tried to do with this film is make something which is entertaining, has a narrative. I mean, I'm trying to make it as much a cinematic film or a televisual film as well as possible, but also one that informs and moves you. And, you know, we mustn't let the broadcasters off the hook. You know, this CBC in your country, very, very last thing. You know, the one country that I'm really struggling to sell this film to is the United States. And one broadcaster, who I won't mention, put in an email, "We don't think our audience will be interested in this." They've had 800,000 of their soldiers traveling to and really putting their lives on the line in Afghanistan. They've spent, well, about 2.7 trillion, probably about 2 trillion has come from the United States. They've had at least 2,600 soldiers, military, killed, untold numbers injured physically, mentally. It's been hugely important. And yet a broadcaster will respond with an email, "We don't think our audience will be interested in that." That's dreadful. And it plays right up to the top. You know, how much did Trump really know who the Afghans were? How much does Biden really know? Well, you can't just fly into the airport and fly out and say, I've been to Afghanistan. Understand who they are, because Mir and his wife and his 3 kids are exactly the type of really nice family, no different to you or me, who were wading through that canal of human sewage to get to the airport, to get out of there. And if we understand who they are, then we can understand how to help them.
Well said. Thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching.